some really seminal research that has helped me a lot. And this is Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. So almost on any team in any environment, public or private, teams run into these 5 problems. And the problems are an absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. And I really want to share this with you guys, and I'm going to spend some time with you walking through each of these dysfunctions and working on some strategies for how you can overcome them. Because honestly, if you could take nothing away from this presentation else, this is what I want you to understand. A lot of times we think about problems, we think about business problems, and we look for concrete solutions. But if you want to get work done, you need to be able to create high functioning teams that can exist over the long run and can do a lot of work. And when teams stifle, when meetings become boring, when you feel like you're going through the motions of the organization, it's oftentimes because your team is falling victim to one or more of these dysfunctions. So the first dysfunction, and the most important dysfunction, is the absence of trust. So this is really the fear of being vulnerable with team members that prevents the building of trust within the team. And when we talk about trust, we have to assume a few things, right? We have to assume that trust is the foundation of teamwork, and that teamwork is the best long-run predictor of success for the organization. And that's not my statement, right? That's very well documented in the research that teams that work together outperform teams that simply have high functioning members. So if you think about like the Miami Heat, right? They had LeBron James, they had Dwayne Wade, they had stars at every level, Chris Bosh, but they couldn't win, right? And it wasn't until they found a dynamic by adding another player to that team that they were actually able to be successful and win 2 championships. So teamwork is more important than individual ability. And finally, this last equation is really important. Success equals teamwork equals trust equals vulnerability. And that last part, vulnerability, right? That's really what we need to focus on, because I don't think anyone would disagree that success is a good thing, teamwork is a good thing, that trust is a good thing. But when we start talking about vulnerability at work, I know that there's probably some questions out there. So in order to understand how we can become vulnerable and why we should become vulnerable, I want to introduce you to a researcher, very prolific woman, Dr. Brené Brown. And we're going to watch a short video about vulnerability and why it's important for building trust.
So I started looking in the research.
Give me just a second to set this up. It came up in a different window. Okay, can you guys see a YouTube window? Somebody give me a yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I started looking in the research, and I found a definition from Charles Feltman that I think is the most beautiful definition I've ever heard. And it's simply this: trust is choosing to make something important to you vulnerable to the actions of someone else. Choosing to make something important to you vulnerable to the actions of someone else. Feltman says that distrust is what I have shared with you that is important to me is not safe with you. So I thought, that's true. And Feltman really calls for this, let's understand what trust is. So we went back into all the data to find out, can I figure out what trust is? Do I know what trust is from the data? And I think I do know what trust is. And I put together an acronym, BRAVING, B-R-A-V-I-N-G, braving. Because when we trust, we are braving connection with someone. So what are the parts of trust? B, boundaries. I trust you if you are clear about your boundaries and you hold them and you're clear about my boundaries and you respect them. There is no trust without boundaries. R, reliability. I can only trust you if you do what you say you're going to do, and not once. Reliability, let me tell you what reliability is in research terms. We're always looking for things that are valid and reliable. Any researchers here or research kind of geeks? There's 10 of us. Okay, so we would say a scale that you weigh yourself on is valid if you get on it and it's an accurate weight. 120. Okay. So that would be a very valid scale. I would pay a lot of money for that scale. So that's actually not a valid scale, but we'll pretend for the sake of this. That's a valid scale. A reliable scale is a scale that if I got on it 100 times, it's going to say the same thing every time. So what reliability is you do what you say you're going to do over and over and over again. You cannot gain and earn my trust if you're reliable once, because that's not the definition of reliability. In our working lives, reliability means that we have to be very clear on our limitations so we don't take on so much that we come up short and don't deliver on our commitments. In our personal life, it means the same thing. So when we say to someone, oh God, it was so great seeing you, I'm gonna give you a call and we can have lunch. Yes or no? No. It was really great seeing you. Moment of discomfort, goodbye. Right? But honest. So B, boundaries. R, reliability. A, huge, accountability. I can only trust you if, when you make a mistake, you are willing to own it, apologize for it, and make amends. I can only trust you if, when I make a mistake, I am allowed to own it, apologize, and make amends. No accountability, no trust. V, and this one shook me to the core. Vault. The vault. What I share with you, you will hold in confidence. What you share with me, I will hold in confidence. But you know what we don't understand? And this came up over and over again in the research. We don't understand the other side of the vault. That's only one door on the vault. Here's where we lose trust with people. If a good friend comes up to me and says, oh my God, did you hear about Caroline? They're getting a divorce. And it is ugly. I'm pretty sure her partner's cheating. You have just shared something with me that was not yours to share. And now my trust for you, even though you're gossiping and giving me the juice, now my trust for you is completely diminished. Does that make sense? So the vault is not just about the fact that you hold my confidences. It's that in our relationship, I see that you acknowledge confidentiality. Here's the tricky thing about the vault. A lot of times, we share things that are not ours to share as a way to hotwire connection with a friend, right? If you don't have anything nice to say, come sit next to me. You know, that's our, yes or no? Like, our closeness is built on talking bad about other people. You know what I call that? Common enemy intimacy. What we have is not real. The intimacy we have is built on hating the same people. And that's counterfeit. That's counterfeit trust. That's not real. So the vault means you respect my story, but you respect other people's story. I, integrity. I cannot trust you and be in a trusting relationship with you if you do not act from a place of integrity and encourage me to do the same. So what is integrity? So I came up with this definition because I didn't like any of the ones out there, and that's what I do when I don't like them. I do. I look in the data and I say, what's integrity? Here's what I think integrity is. 3 pieces. It's choosing courage over comfort, choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy, and practicing your values, not just professing your values. Right? I mean, that's integrity. In non-judgment, I can fall apart, ask for help, and be in struggle without being judged by you. And you can fall apart and be in struggle and ask for help without being judged by me. Which is really hard because we're better at helping than we are asking for help. And we think that we've set up trusting relationships with people who really trust us because we're always there to help them. But let me tell you this, if you can't ask for help and they cannot reciprocate that, that is not a trusting relationship, period. And when we assign value to needing help, when I think less of myself for needing help, whether you're conscious of it or not, when you offer help to someone, you think less of them too. You cannot judge yourself for needing help, but not judge others for needing your help. And somewhere in there, if you're like me, you're getting value from being a helper in a relationship. You think that's your worth. But real trust doesn't exist unless help is reciprocal and non-judgment. The last one is G, generosity. Our relationship is only a trusting relationship if you can assume the most generous thing about my words, intentions, and behaviors, and then check in with me. So if I screw up, say something, forget something, you will make a generous assumption and say, yesterday was my mom's 1-year anniversary of her death, and it was really tough for me, and I talked to you about it last month. And I really was hoping that you would have called. But I know you care about me. I know you think it's a big deal, so I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about that. As opposed to not returning calls, not returning emails, and waiting for the moment where you can spring, well, you forgot to call on this important, you'll make a generous assumption about me and check it out. Does that make sense? So we've got boundaries, reliability, accountability, the vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. This is the anatomy of trust, and it's complex.
Okay, so I know that's a big acronym. You're probably going, okay, how do I remember all that? What's the B? What's the V? Oh, I still hear her. You guys hear her? Hold on. Okay, sorry. Voices in my head, right? I'm going crazy. Okay, so let me get that acronym up there so that you can see it. So we'll get the presentation back on here. Okay, so there it is in case you were struggling to keep up with that or were trying to take notes. But my question is, does it sound like we're talking about a workplace relationship when you hear Dr. Brown speak, or does it seem like it's more of a personal relationship? And how do we employ the Braving acronym and these ideas in our workplace relationships? It's probably easier to do in our professional setting, right? With our partners, with our friends, with our family. But do you guys have a lot of experience doing this in a workplace setting? What do you think? Have you ever had a manager or a leader that made you feel this way, that made you feel like you could trust them, that you could be vulnerable with them? It's a kind of a rare thing. Well, I think it is a pretty rare thing. And I think a lot of organizations, even really big, really powerful organizations, suffer from the rarity of trust. And I think that teams struggle to achieve trust for two primary reasons. They have a lack of a shared definition, right? Whether it's Brené Brown's definition or other theorists' definition, the organization at itself doesn't value trust in the workplace, right? Again, they're thinking of people as automatons. They're saying you're robots. You can come in here and work, and we get an output and we give an input to you, right? We pay you. So we pay you and you do work, and that's what this is about, right? They don't see trust as the cornerstone of leadership on a team. And finally, I think the other reason is that it goes against our nature as people, right? It's tough to be vulnerable, right? We're trained from a very early age that we want to have the answers, that we want to solve the problems, that we want to be strong, self-reliant people. So to be vulnerable is difficult. And we have to engage in what I like to call altruistic vulnerability. And it's altruistic because we must be vulnerable in the organization without knowing whether it will be respected or reciprocated all the time. And I think what we do know about trust is that it's hard to get and it's easy to lose. Is that a fair statement? Hard to get and easy to lose. So how would we do this with our teams? And I think there's a few different ways we can do it. So these are some examples that I'd like you to do with your team if you want to try to build trust. And when we talk about building trust, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, I'm just supposed to stand in a room and, have people line up, and then everyone's going to fall back into each other's arms, and then boom, we have trust because we caught each other. We didn't fall on the floor. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but still not so complicated that you couldn't try to do it. And you can either do it in a formal setting, like an offsite retreat or a team building session, or you can do it just around the water cooler at work, wherever people congregate. If you go out to lunch with your people, or you spend any time with them in unstructured social settings, those are still great opportunities to work on your trust as a team. And one exercise that I like to do with all of my teams is I encourage them to tell me their personal history. So oftentimes, I do this while I'm onboarding new employees, and that's a great time to do it. But you can do it even with people that you've worked with for a long time, because sometimes I'm surprised. We spend almost as much time, or in some organizations, more time with our coworkers than we do with our friends and family. But yet what we know about them in a personal setting is oftentimes very skin deep. We might know a lot about how they work in the organization and what they do all day long while they're in the office, but we don't know that much about them outside that. So this helps to kind of break down those barriers and let people know that they're more than just their job function. So it's really easy to do. There's 3 questions, and you can simply ask your team members, where did they grow up? How many kids are in their family? And what was the most difficult or important challenge that they faced in their childhood? And I say childhood, but not inner childhood, because it's not a therapy session where we're saying, well, how do you feel retrospectively about it? We're saying, look, what was an actual challenge? What was something concrete or difficult, right, that you went through? And this is a great way to break down the walls. So it's really, really easy to do.
Adam, can I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
When you asked this, were people very open about it? Because, you have people that are very private, they don't want to disclose that, or kind of, why are you asking me all these questions?
Yeah, so what I do is I always preface it, right? I have a disclaimer. I say, hey, I just want to get to know you a little better. You don't have to do this. You don't have to respond to any of these things, because you're absolutely right. People are suspect. And most of the time when you hear someone say, well, I'm a private person, right? I don't like to talk about those things. That's a tell for you as a manager, because most of the time what people are really saying is, I don't feel comfortable being vulnerable with you as a manager in this workplace setting, because I might tell you something and it may be used against me later. My vulnerability will not be altruistically reciprocated. You won't let me be vulnerable with you, and you won't be vulnerable with me. And a great way that you can assure people that that is not the case is by leading by example, by leading with integrity and being vulnerable with them first, right? It can be a little scary because, again, a lot of us have this bias that to be a leader and to be a manager, we have to always have the right answer, that we have to be perfect in every way. We all know we're not, whether we want the world to think that or we want our organization to think that. And so what I do is I lead by being vulnerable myself. And then oftentimes, even those really reserved, really private and shy people will oftentimes then want to participate in that relationship with me because they know it's genuine and they know it's authentic. You know, one example that I'll tell you is I oftentimes tell a story when I start team building about why these 5 dysfunctions of a team are important. And they're important to me because early on in my career, I bought an industrial business and the business was valued at $2 million. And it was a good deal. And I worked out all the acquisition details. I've worked out the financing, just had this beautiful deal that any Harvard MBA would have been proud to say, that is a good deal. You should buy that business. And I felt very smart for doing it. But I neglected the team. I neglected the culture. And so 5 years later, I had to close that business because the team had gotten so out of hand that the business couldn't perform anymore. You know, that's the kind of vulnerability that we're talking about. As I said, look, guys, we need to learn this now because I didn't learn it then. And it cost $2 million in my case. So that's the kind of vulnerability that they see. Look, you know, Adam's the leader, but he's not always right. He makes mistakes. And man, when he does poorly, those mistakes are big, right? There's not a lot of people that want to own or tell people about losing $2 million and having consequences that lasted for a decade after the fact, right? But when they see that there is no gotcha, there is no way that it's going to be used against them, then a lot of times people want to engage in that, right? Because remember, we have that need. If you believed Maslow, we have that need for love and belonging and friendship. People are not solitary creatures. They don't want to operate in a vacuum. But one thing you can do, if those 3 questions seem too scary or seem like a bad way to start, we have another exercise because you can do some behavioral profiling. You can do the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And is anyone familiar with the Myers-Briggs? Anyone, you know, ever been told you're an ENTJ or an ISTP? These are the 2 of the 16 personality types that exist in the Myers-Briggs. Anyone ever done that analysis?
We used to do it with the county years ago.
Okay, so it's really great, right? Because it's been around long enough that people don't think that it's some kind of employment verification test. It's in pop culture, it's in our lexicon, we know it, people actually like it, right? It's like, I oftentimes think it's like taking a quiz in a magazine to find out, you know, what type of car is best for me, or, you know, what type of, of guy or girl I am and who I should be dating, right? It's like the stuff you used to read in Cosmopolitan magazine or something like that. But it's objective and it's reliable, and that's what people like about it. And it gives us a shared way that we can communicate about our personalities, right? Not about our traits, right? You learned Clifton's strengths in your previous session, and that speaks to a lot of our strengths and capabilities. But in order to have trust, in order to master this vulnerability thing, we have to be comfortable talking about ourselves and our behavior and our personality. So the Myers-Briggs is a great way to do that because you can do it online now. I put the link on here on the slide. So if you ever wanted to do this with your teams, you can do it online. And that way they know that there is an objective research-based process happening here and that it's not going to be bastardized by you as the manager, right? They know that no one's going to mess with this science. And so a lot of times that makes people more comfortable with it. And they know there's no wrong answer, right? An organization needs all these personality types. So I just put this here so you could see some of the personality types, but those acronyms that I was telling you, like ENTJ or ISTJ, they revolve around 4 different dimensions. And you can think of each of these things as continuums. So on one end of the continuum, you might have an extroverted person or an introverted person. And you're not one or the other. You could kind of be anywhere along the continuum. If you drew a line, you could be more favorable towards extroversion or more favorable towards introversion, or you could be anywhere in between, right? You might be right in the middle, right? And so this personality assessment will ask you questions designed to figure out that dimension, extroversion versus introversion. It'll also have a dimension on sensing versus intuition, right? So if you're a sensing person, you pay attention to concrete facts, right? You prefer ideas that have practical applications, versus if you're a person that relies on intuition, you like to describe things in a figurative or poetic way, or you might imagine the possibilities of not just what is, but what could be. So that's the other dimension. That's that second dimension. So we've got introversion, extroversion, sensing versus intuition. Then we come to thinking versus feeling. So again, sometimes those get confused, right? Because when we're talking about sensing, we're talking about the way we think about things. But when we talk about the third dimension here, we really are talking about how we make decisions. So number 2 is how we think about things. Number 3 is how we make decisions. So if we're a thinking person, we like to describe things, right, in a reasonable, level-headed way. We enjoy finding the flaws in an argument. You know, we value things like justice, fairness, equity, and we make decisions in a very impersonal way, very empirical way. Well, this is what the data shows. This is what the numbers say, right? Objectively, this is true. So that's a thinking person. A feeling person is a person that bases those decisions on their personal values, right? Their beliefs. They want to live in harmony. They try to offer people forgiveness and grace. And, you know, they could be described as a warm or a more empathetic person, right? Because they value how things feel, not just what they might be empirically or objectively. And then finally, the fourth dimension is how you prefer to live your outer life, right? So if you prefer to think in things like rules and deadlines and you believe that they should be respected, right? That's like me saying, hey, I know that the modern workforce doesn't revolve around a factory, but I still think that in many cases for the group dynamic, that maybe that boss that was telling Hamza that he should arrive at 9 instead of habitually late may still have something, right? Because I'm a judging person, right? So I prefer that those rules be respected. But I'm also emotionally intelligent enough to understand why sometimes they need to be broken. If you're a perceiving person, on the other hand, you see those rules as more flexible, right? So I err on the side of judging, but I can kind of come over to perceiving on that time issue. And I can say, well, yeah, maybe in his case, it wasn't a big deal because he could just as easily work on his assignments at home as he could at the office. And one of the things that I think always denotes a perceiving person is this idea of enjoying spontaneity, of liking surprises, right? You can tell a lot about a person if you just say, hey, how do you react to surprises? Because there'll be people tell you, I hate surprises. I get so nervous. If your friend was going on a trip and they said, we're not going to tell you where we're going, right? Just get in the car. We're going to be gone for the weekend. Pack a bag. Some people would love that. And those are perceiving people. Judging people would probably not like that very much. Where are we going? What road are we taking? How are we going to get there? Do I need to bring a sweater? Right? Those are more telltale signs of a judging person. So this is a great thing that you can do with your team too. And the goal here isn't really to find out whether one of these personality types is better than the other. It's simply to explore and understand the people on your team so that, again, you can use these personalities and they can contribute in the best way to the organization. What I also think is interesting about Myers-Briggs is that if you do it as a team, you can have a team personality type. So you can take the individual or component personality types of the individuals on the team, and then you can put them together and you can find out what the group personality type looks like. And you can assess strengths or weaknesses as they may relate to what the organization needs based on what the team can do. When Shara was talking and she made her comment about how she manages her team, I heard a lot of what I felt was like an intuition or an understanding of each of those players and what they could contribute to the team. So even if it wasn't defined as types of personalities, ENTP, ISFP, with those acronyms, that's what I heard coming through. And that's a really good thing, right? So you may want to consider incorporating trust into your teams so that you can really move forward to the next level. right? People can relate to, they can feel like it's okay to be vulnerable. They don't have to have the right answers. They can come to you with questions, right? Anyone ever been afraid to go to the boss and say, I don't know how to do the job, or I think there's a better way to do it, or I'm not really sure if this is working? For every time someone says that to me, I believe that there's 10 other times when they don't, when they just say, well, this is what I was told to do, so I'm just going to keep doing it, even if I really feel like it's a bad idea. So our takeaways for trust. Trust is the foundation of teamwork. On a team, trust is about vulnerability, and that's difficult for most people. Building trust takes time, but targeted exercises like the two that we talked about can accelerate the process. There's lots of other exercises that you can use too. Those are just two that have worked really well for me. And just like a good marriage or partnership, trust on a team is never complete. It must be maintained over time. So I try at all staff meetings that I'm a part of to make sure that I water the seeds of trust in the organization. Because this isn't just, hey, we did a session, we did Myers-Briggs, I asked you some questions about you, you asked me some questions about me, so now we trust each other, right? It has to be reaffirmed many, many times in order for people to believe it. But if they do believe it, it makes the next part easier, because good organizations need to have conflict. Now we're going to turn our attention to the idea of exploring how we can use conflict in the organization. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, use conflict. That sounds a little oxymoronic. We want to avoid conflict, right? We want to mitigate conflict. We want to control conflict. But I can assure you that as managers, there are a lot of positive elements of using conflict that get undersold in terms of our thinking. So I like to think of conflict as a continuum rather than as a word with a pejorative or a negative connotation to it. So on one end of the conflict continuum, we have artificial harmony. And artificial harmony happens when people are more concerned about maintaining the status quo on the team than they are about finding the best solutions, getting the right answer, or even having their voice be heard. On the other end of the continuum, we have destructive conflict, right? These are personal attacks. These are character assassination. These are conflict that's based on, our prejudices and things like that are really bad and are always bad, right? They're not good for society. They're not good for your organization. But in the middle, midway through that continuum, there's an optimal level of conflict. And that's ideological conflict. That's conflict that's based around ideas and the best and most productive and efficient ways of doing things. So that's the kind of conflict that as managers is really life-giving to our teams, because we can use that conflict to find the best processes and procedures. And we can explore all ideas, and we can know that the decisions that we're making as a group are better than any one decision that an individual could come up with, whether that be you or any select person on your team, right? This is the old cliche that 2 heads are better than 1 and 3 heads are better than 2. Well, that's the idea that if we get a bunch of people together and they're all unafraid to speak their mind around the issue, we'll probably come up with a solution that's better than any of us would come up with on our own. But if artificial harmony reigns supreme, then people will be afraid to enter into that conflict, because they'll be afraid that if they tell somebody that they think they have a better idea or they think there's another perspective to be considered, that it might be used against them, right? Or that it won't be well received. So the last thing that I want to tell you about this idea of the conflict continuum is that conflict and commitment are also positively correlated. And so what that means in terms of research is that the more conflict we have, the more commitment we have. And that as conflict increases, commitment increases. So if we don't have conflict on our teams, we can't expect our team members to commit to the decisions that we make, which is really weird, right? Because most of the time, if you have to make a decision, you want to get people to agree to it, and you want to get them to agree to it so that you can move forward. And you want to avoid conflict in that process. And so a lot of times you run around trying to have like sidebar conversations with people and try to mitigate the conflict and have the conflict even directed at you as opposed to the team or the idea. But all those solutions are prefacing artificial harmony over productive ideological debate around the issue. So know that if you want your team to be committed to whatever decision it is that you're trying to make, you have to go through this process of engaging in conflict to get them there. And if you see it that way, conflict becomes more positive. It becomes something that we can deal with, maybe even something that we like, right? I really like it when I'm having a staff meeting with my managers and everybody gets passionate and charged up and they're, well, I think this and I think this and what about that? And did you consider this? Because I know that we're in our groove, that we're getting things done, that we're moving forward in a way that's going to yield something really good. So even though there may be some missteps along the way, or there may be somebody that needs to clarify what they say, sorry, I didn't mean to say it that way. I wasn't trying to attack you. I was just trying to make this point about my customers or about our department or about our client. You know, a lot of times it's very easily resolved. So it's not really a big deal, but it's more than worth it. So if you're struggling to resolve conflict on your team, if you're thinking, well, I want to try this, but if I get in too deep, and I can't resolve the conflict with a quick apology or an I'm sorry, or a let me rephrase that for you. If you need some strategies on what to do, this graph is you, because this bullseye in the middle is the issue, right? Whatever issue you're trying to describe. And these obstacles that exist here in blue text are all things that can get in the way of talking about the issue at hand. So there can be individual obstacles, relationship obstacles, environmental obstacles, or even informational obstacles. And as you can see by looking around at some of these words, you kind of get the idea at what each of these obstacles might be. So if we're dealing with individual obstacles that are making it hard to resolve conflict, we might be dealing with issues like our self-esteem or our values or our intelligence, our IQ or our EQ. That's our emotional quotient or our emotional intelligence that we have, right? If we have two individuals and one says, well, I think this way and those are my beliefs, and another person says, well, I think that way and those are my beliefs, then we're struggling with an individual obstacle because those two people are butting heads simply because their values don't line up. So a lot of times if we recognize that as managers, we can kind of help because we can go, okay, you know, you two people, employee X and employee Y, I get what you're saying and I hear you. Neither one of you is wrong. Both of your values are fine. What we're really talking about today is this idea. So stop thinking in terms of yourself, start thinking more generally about what we can do as a group or what we can do as an organization. That's a real good way to shift the conversation away from somebody's individual values and more about the group decision-making process as a whole, because we all will fall victim to that. We'll all look at a scenario and at first we almost naturally and inevitably think, what does that mean to me as an individual? That's okay, we all get there. But for a lot of us, we're able to consider how it affects me as an individual, but we're also able to consider how it affects other groups of people. And that's really where you want your employees to be, so that they get out of thinking, well, it might be more work for me if we do that, but it also might benefit another department that we work with. So maybe we know it will be more work, but we're willing to take the work on because we acknowledge that if we were able to do this, the organization as a whole will be better for it. So that would be an example of an individual obstacle. Environmental obstacles are something that we're dealing with a lot right now. Right? I mean, this is like the physical world. So the pandemic has created lots of physical barriers that prevent your team from working together, right? Through no fault of anyone on the team. So these could be things like your physical geography, the way meeting spaces are laid out, the way, you know, you have to relate together, people being in different time zones. These could all be physical or environmental concerns that could affect the way your team works out. For example, I once had an employee and they were in a time zone that was 8 hours away from the company's time zone. And it was really hard for this person to participate on team meetings because they were logging on to meetings at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm expecting them to be all jazzed up and, have these high levels of engagement with lots of passion and lots of conflict. And they're going, hey, it's 2:30 in the morning here, right? I need to go to sleep. This meeting schedule doesn't work for me because, I'm on the other side of the world. So that would be an example of a physical barrier. Once we get past all these potential obstacles, we can actually get to the issue itself. And most of the time, if you're doing a good job with conflict on your team, you'll stay in this kind of informational bubble, kind of the pink part of the graph there, where your discussion will be centered around facts and opinions and perspective. And that will let you to really address the issue at hand in a way that is organizationally appropriate and acceptable. But as we've seen with our decision makers during the pandemic, facts and opinions can be easily conflated, right? They can be confused for being one or the other. If you think about different ways that different states have responded to the pandemic, right? They all don't agree to the same facts. We all don't have the same opinions. You look at politics, right? The way the Trump administration handled the pandemic versus the way the Biden administration is handling the pandemic. We see a lot of values that get exchanged for facts and a lot of opinions that get politicized and they get distorted as facts. So know that can happen on a small scale in your team too, right? So make sure that as a manager, you do a good job of saying, okay, when we're talking about an opinion, it's okay for you guys to have opinions. I welcome it, but also be able to lay out the facts as they relate to your organization. Because that way you can kind of help establish a good territory for what's up for debate, but what is not debatable. Because we can't debate everything, right? We can't assume that any fact is open to debate because it probably isn't, right? For you or for the organization, right? There'll be certain things that you need everybody to accept so that the conversation can move forward. So your goal as a conflict creator is to set a stage where good, productive, ideological conflict can happen. And from time to time, you also will have to be a moderator, but you should work to try to mitigate the amount of times where you have to step in. You're better to let your team members solve their own problems. If they get into conflict with one another, you can facilitate that and support it, but you should resist the temptation to squash it. Because if you squash the conversation just because sometimes it gets uncomfortable or sometimes people misstep a little, you're going to be unable to see all the good productive benefits of conflict. And your team will get used to the idea that you are going to be the referee. And you're not going to be the referee. You want to contribute. You want to bring your voice and your experience to the table. So you don't always want to be worried about what everybody else is thinking and feeling and saying in the heat of these meetings. If you feel like your staff meetings are boring and you're just going through the motions and getting through it and you have to do it each week because somebody said that you have to have a meeting, then you probably are not engaging in enough conflict. Right? Because when good conflict is taking place on a team, meetings are lively. People look forward to it because they say, we're going to solve problems. We're going to get stuff done. We're going to, clear the air and I won't, have to keep tripping on this same issue, whatever the issue might be. So they're excited to get things done and to be productive and effective. And they know that they're going to have a voice and a hand in making change possible. If it's boring, if your staff meetings are simply you just talking to the group, counting the minutes and hours until the meeting is over, consider introducing more conflict into your meeting. So know that your norms for conflict are going to vary. I've talked about conflict on my team, and I said it's kind of brash, right? The company is growing very quickly. People are moving very fast. We're, constantly scaling and hitting our stride. And we have really big enterprise goals. So people know that when you're moving quick in a meeting and you're blunt, right? If you say, hey, that's a dumb idea, you don't think your colleague that just said something is actually a dumb person. You're just saying that would never work and here's why. So that's a really open conflict. And we had to work really hard to get to that point where people didn't take it personal, where they knew that everybody that was around the table or around the Zoom meeting was there to help, and that it was kind of us going back to back against the world. For your teams, they might not be ready for that, or that might not even be appropriate for your organization. So just as we set up some norms at the beginning of the day for our session, maybe consider what your conflict norms will look like on your team. How will you want people to relate to each other? Because if you voice that, if you say, we're going to have conflict, but we're always going to remain respectful, we're always going to be empathetic, we're always going to make generous assumptions about our fellow teammates, you kind of give them a framework that they can work in. And that's helpful, especially when things are new, because then people will realize that you want to hear their voice, but that they're not going to be attacked and they're not going to be a victim simply because they raise their hand and say, I don't agree. I don't think we should do that. There's a better way to make it happen. And as I mentioned, don't fear the occasional personal conflict between people. If you're doing well on your team and you have good trust and you've already crossed that bridge, people will be able to work it out, just like you would work it out with your family or your friends or other relationships in life. You don't throw away a friendship just because you disagreed with somebody on a small issue, right? You agree to disagree, you move forward, you change your mind, they change their mind, or you know that the relationship is simply just worth more than whatever you engaged in conflict about. And if the conflict are centered around the ideas, then they're never about the people, right? They're just about the process. And if your team's going to be successful, they realize that the best processes have to win. The best ideas have to take hold, and they're the things that we're going to commit to. So without conflict, we don't get commitment. But commitment is also the opposite of consensus, because your team is probably seldom going to agree on the things that you ask them to buy into and the things that they have to commit to. But if you've gone through this process of letting everyone speak their mind and be heard, they're a lot more likely to commit and buy in and say, look, even though I didn't get 100% of what I wanted in the meeting, I know my teammates listened to me and I know my leader listened to me. So I'm willing to try. I'm willing to make this successful. If you don't do these things and you simply just assign a change and say, this is what we're going to do, there'll be a lot of people that go, well, I thought it was a bad idea, but she told me to do it. So whatever, I did the best I could, but I knew it was a bad idea to begin with. So I'm not surprised when it failed. And people will actually be okay with their own failure and the failure of the team, which you don't want that to ever be the case. You know, it's weird when people don't align their personal success with the organization's success, right? In business and in entrepreneurship, you know, maybe Danielle with her side business feels the same way I do. It's really weird because if the organization isn't succeeding, nobody's succeeding, right? If we're not selling goods and services and we're not moving forward, then nobody's getting a paycheck, right? That's not going to happen. But a lot of times in the public sector, you know, I see it in the college, just like you guys see it at DPSS, people can become disconnected from the institution. Like, well, I'm still going to have my job. I'm still going to get my paycheck. So it doesn't really matter if our team is successful or our organization is successful because we're just a societal institution. But if the pandemic has shown us one thing, that only exists in a certain bound of rationality, right? That only exists if certain other conditions are in place. So it's not a foregone conclusion that if the organization fails, that everyone that works in it is going to be okay, right? It'll be restructured. It'll be changed. There'll be new ways to do it. They'll find new people. They'll find automated processes. They'll do things in a way that mitigate the failure. So you don't want your team to ever be comfortable with making a decision but not committing to it. You need them to commit to those things because you need them to be successful, even though you know from time to time they're not going to agree. They're going to have to move forward even if they disagree. And that's what buy-in is about, right? Buying is getting commitment and getting individuals to move forward precisely because they don't agree. But even disagree and commit isn't enough to get things done. In order to have really good commitment, we also need to work on our communication styles and strategies. So two communication techniques that I'd like to discuss with you are the ideas of clarity and cascading communication. So when we talk about clarity in terms of management communication, we're talking about language and rhetoric and style that dispels the assumptions which leaders make about what they have agreed to do and forges alignments that allow employees to act. So a lot of times if you have a meeting and you say, okay, we agreed on it, we committed, we had buy-in, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. As the leader, you say that was the goal. The goal to have this meeting was to get the team to do X, Y, and Z. And so as the leader, that's what you think is going to happen. But without clarity, there may be individual assumptions about who's going to do what. Like whose responsibility is it to do X, Y, and Z? Is it employee 1, employee 2, employee 3, employee 10? What do you need each person to do? So clarity is going to dispel all those unspoken assumptions and talk about those things concretely so that employees can act on the changes and decisions that everyone has agreed to. Because I'm sure we've all had a meeting where you talk about an issue so circularly and for such a long period of time that by the end of it, like the meeting ends, but you don't exactly know what you need to do or how to do it or what the next step should be. So in those situations, clarity is missing. Does that idea of clarity make sense? I know it's not a hard idea, but for some reason, it's always a little shaky as to how to actually implement it. Okay, good. So cascading communication happens when leaders go back and communicate decisions that have been made to their team or their staff. So a lot of times this happens when a decision gets made at the top of the organization and then it kind of trickles down. And at each level of the organization, the manager has to use cascading communication to explain to their staff what they need to do to align themselves to the strategic goals and objectives of the organization. So you might not have been in the room when the manager made the decision, but now you have the responsibility to go to your team and say, okay, the decision has been made and this is what we have to do. And this is what you need to do. And this is what I'm going to do. And this is what our counterparts are going to do so that you can enroll them in that vision. And it's really important because if they don't understand that global picture, they don't understand that message that's come down from the top and is now getting to them. It's a bit like playing a game of telephone like you did in grade school, right? Where everybody sits around in a circle and somebody whispers into someone's ear and then it goes around. And by the time it gets back to the same person, it's not the same message anymore. Well, that happens in an organization that lacks cascading communication because sometimes the goals and objectives that get set in the top don't get implemented that way by the line level staff. So this can be important because a lot of times if your managers, right, at the mid-level tier, if someone is communicating to you and you're confused and you don't feel like you understand how the communication is cascading, then it's going to be really hard for you to communicate that to your team. So a lot of times what you can do when you're in the middle of an organization is you can kind of manage up because you can go to your managers or your leadership team and you can say, look, I need to understand this because I'm not necessarily fighting it or disagreeing it, but if I don't understand it, I can't explain it to my team. And if I can't explain it to my team, then they're not going to understand what I want them to do or what you want me to do or what your managers want you to do at the top of the organization. And so you kind of got to lay it out that bluntly. And it's normally well received. Nobody's going to get mad at you. But at the same time, you need to keep talking and asking questions until you understand enough of the narrative that you can explain it to your team. A lot of times you'll get pushback from your manager and he or she will just say, well, it is what it is. I didn't make the decision, but this is what we have to do. So, I'm really busy. You're really busy. Can you just go tell your team to do this now? And you'll say, hey, I will. I'll get there. But it'll be better if I can explain to them the whys and the hows of what we need to do. Because if I just say what we need to do, I'm not really empowering them with a lot to be successful. And I'm not really giving them anything that they can sink their teeth into and buy in with. And so you're going to want to iterate on those conversations with your manager until you have enough to tell the story. And then you're going to want to think about how you want to tell the story, right? What the thematic goals of management are. Why are they trying to do this? Are they trying to cut costs? Are they trying to improve efficiency? Are they trying to maximize exposure or outreach or marketing? What are the thematic goals of what management is trying to do? Because if I understand those, I can communicate that to my staff, and then they won't just think that they're cogs in the wheel. They'll understand how their actions are going to directly align with what's needed to be successful in the goal. And that's super important. So the final thing that you need to consider when talking about cascading communication is the method of communication. On the call this morning, there was someone that was saying that their manager above them, they were an eligibility supervisor, always wanted to make sure that everybody had the same information at the same time. And so she would ask her leadership team to all send emails like, okay, you need to send this email and you need to communicate this to all your team, and you need to do it on Monday morning by 9 a.m. to make sure that everybody has the information, everybody knows. And so at its core, it's not a bad thing because she wants everybody to have the same information and she wants them to get it at the same time. But one of the things that we discussed was that for some people, finding out about certain changes asynchronously in an email is not the best way to talk to them, right? Maybe for your team, you'll say, okay, look, I'm going to communicate the information and I'll make sure I do it by Monday at 9 a.m. But sending an email to everybody and just letting them react and start spinning after reading something that could be negative is not the way I want to do it. I want to have a meeting. I want to get them together on Zoom. I want to have a face-to-face. I'm going to do whatever you think is best. But I need to communicate this to my team in a way that values our norms around conflict. Because if I just send them an email and say, deal with this, we've all been there, right? Before you've even finished reading the email, you're just spun up. You're just moving forward. You're thinking about the 15 reasons why what you're reading is the worst thing you've ever read, and you're no longer even willing to buy into the change. You're just upset. You're just, thinking this will never work, right? I need to turn this off. I need to get out of here. I need to put this down. So think about the way that you communicate, because sometimes the vision of management, particularly upper management, is a double-edged sword, right? It won't always work for all your people. They'll say, well, that doesn't work for me. That doesn't make my life better or easier, whatever it is. And so as you think about these things, you're going to need to be able to clearly articulate the goals, and you're going to need to do it in a persuasive way, in a way that makes people see that even if you are asking them to change, that there is a method to that madness, that you're doing it for good and noble reasons. So I get worried, when we get so focused on the equity of the conversation that we make sure everybody has the information in a very unrobust way of communication, like email, right? This is a lot more robust, a lot more collaborative. You can see if I'm happy, you can see what my face looks like. If I'm silent, if I'm silent, but I'm nodding my head, then I'm agreeing with you. I'm like, yeah, right on, really good. But if I'm silent with my arms crossed and I'm scowling, ooh, right? Adam's upset. That doesn't work, right? So I can't see any of that with email. I just hit send and it's gone. And I have no idea how you react to it. So what I encourage you to do is when you're engaging in cascading communication, use the most robust means of communication possible, because that gives you the best chance of being able to persuasively and articulately convey the thematic goals of management. Okay, so we are picking up speed. You guys are doing great. Any questions about conflict or commitment or anything we've discussed since we came back from the break? We're doing good?
I have a question.
Sure.
So you're saying that you want us to introduce conflict to our teams. Like, what's a good way to do that without it being like going crazy? I was thinking in my head, like there's always these things on social media, like you have to get rid of one. Which one would you choose? Like that's something that I would think to introduce. because I'm just thinking about things to do in my next unit meeting, and I want to start implementing this, but I don't know exactly what some examples are of introducing conflict to my team.
Okay, what I would say is conflict is our second step. Trust is our first step, right? So if we have really high levels of trust, conflict is a lot easier. If we start with conflict, we can deal with kind of the superficial examples like, okay, we're on a desert island, you know, what do we take? Do we take a knife or do we take a shovel? We can play games, but nobody's really going to care about that because they're like, well, it's just a game. If you want them to be able to translate that into talking about their work and about decision and about disagreement with each other on the team and potentially with you, we got to start with trust. But when you get to trust and you have conflict, what I do is I do two things. One, I start by showing them the value of conflict. So just like I explained it to you, you're going to say, look, guys, I want us to have more conflict in our meetings. And everyone's going to look at you just like you may have looked at me and said, why do you want this? Right? We don't have to trick them, right? We don't have to coerce them. We're not our Theory X managers. So we tell them, right, straight up, this is why I want you to do this because it's good for us. We're going to make better decisions. We're going to be happier. We're all going to feel like we're heard. And then when we have to make a tough call, we're all going to be able to commit and buy in to the process. So I tell them, like, there's no secret. This is what I want you to do. Then I do a fun example, like what you were saying, the quizzes or the social media. What would you rather take? Or we play a game where they have to think critically and they form teams. And so, you know, there's always some disagreement in the team of like, well, what's the best strategy? Do I make this move or that move? Right? Board games can be really good for that too. And again, people are surprised because they're like, you're having us play a game in the unit meeting. We've never done that before. Right? So that's a good thing. But then when we have to relate it to work and people start to get nervous because they're like, well, it's one thing to like win the game or to disagree on a strategy that doesn't matter. It's another thing to like say, hey, Danielle, I don't agree with you. You're wrong. Right? Then I show them the graph of the obstacles. And I say, look, guys, we all fall victim to these. So when we have conflict and it gets personal or it gets a little touchy, or you feel like somebody's attacking you, then this is what we need to do. Here are our norms, right? We're going to try to clarify what we say. We're going to be quick to genuinely apologize if somebody gets offended. And we're going to take into account all the obstacles that might exist. And we're going to highlight it because if they know, right, if you talk to them and you say, look, if we are engaging in conflict and we're talking about our individual values, and I'm saying, I think you're immoral and I think you're immoral and you don't judge this, we're not talking about ideas anymore. That's not the conflict we want at work, right? We want ideological conflict. We don't want value-laden conflict. And so I tell them that because that way, if it gets that way, as a manager, I can say, hey, guys, I think we're falling victim to some individual obstacles here because I hear you all talking about your values, but the issue at hand is really this idea that we're discussing. And then people are like, oh yeah, you did say that. And you did say we'd fall victim to that. And we're all human. So let's just drop that and let's just get back to what we're doing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. You didn't mean it that way. And it's just water under the bridge. So for conflict, I really walk them through the process just like I did you guys. I don't try to trick them. With trust, you have to open up the waters. You have to be vulnerable. You have to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it first. And then you guys are going to do it. So you lead by example. But with conflict, I just straight up give them the who, how, what, where, and when, and why. Awesome question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any others? Okay, let's move on. We are almost done. Embracing accountability, right? So our dysfunction is an inability or an inattention to accountability. So just like with trust, the first thing we have to do is we have to define what accountability means on a team. And accountability has a bad rap, right? I see LaVonda smiling. She's like, my conversations about accountability are normally a bad thing, right? It's somebody's not doing what they're supposed to. Somebody's going to get a conversation. It's call an employee into your office and then you immediately stand up and close the door, right? Everyone knows that's not a good conversation. You want to talk about a way to ramp the stress level up to 10, summon someone to your office and then close the door, right? So don't do those things, right? You can have that same conversation. You can do it in a way where you don't have to automatically put someone on the defense, because most of the time the situation is not that bad. And when we're talking about accountability, it doesn't have to be so extreme. But the type of accountability that I want you guys to practice is really accountability that starts with each team member's willingness to remind one another when they are not living up to the performance standards of the group. So it's not the closed door conversation where you as the leader are telling people, you're not doing well, you're performing low, we've got to fix this problem, I have to give you a write-up about this, that, or the other. That accountability exists, but everyone understands that dynamic. The two types of accountabilities that really make teams are successful are first and foremost peer-to-peer accountability, and then peer-to-leader. Peer-to-leader, you guys all probably know, and you have to do, and the organization requires you to do it. That's why you're the supervisor. But peer-to-peer is what's lacking on most teams, right? The idea that if your team members have a problem with one another, that before they come to you, they'll first go to their colleague and they'll say, hey, you told me you'd send me that report on Friday. Well, it's now Wednesday of next week. Friday has come and gone. I need that. I can't do my job unless you do your job. So what happened? Where's the report? No, if your organizations are anything like mine, most of the time they come to you and they say, hey, Steve didn't send me the report. You got to go talk to him, right? I'm mad at him. I'm not going to say anything to him though, because geez, what would Steve think if his coworker said anything? But you're the boss, so just go fix this, right? Anyone ever been there? Right? I've been there. It's tough. And a lot of times it makes it heavier, because then what do you have to do? You have to go talk to Steve. Well, Steve, I heard that you didn't give Amanda her report, and that's going to be a big problem. And, you know, we can't do this. Deadlines are important, yada, yada, yada. Same old thing. Cut to the chase. Let's get to the real issue of why didn't Steve send the report? Is there a reason? Did he not know what to do? Did he not know how to do it? Was he sick? Did his dog die? What happened, right, that made us miss the deadline? Because that's ultimately what we care about. And moreover than that, what do we need to do to fix the problem? Because if we spend all day talking about the fact that he didn't send the report, that's not as good as just fixing the problem and getting the report moving forward, right? If there's a delay, then we need to work to mitigate the delay and get the project moving up forward again. So a lot of times that's faster if rather than Amanda and Steve going through Danielle to play mediator and then have 2 conversations or maybe even 3 conversations to get the same thing done. If you just say to Amanda, well, Amanda, if Steve forgot to send the report, did you talk to him? And most of the time she'll say, well, I emailed him. I asked him where it was, or no, I'm talking to you. But you say, well, again, did you talk to him, right? Because emailing somebody is not the same as talking to them. A lot of times, if your employees are afraid to relate to each other on that dimension, it's because they don't agree with this shared definition of accountability. And they don't see that as their role. But I can tell you that teams that are able to use peer-to-peer accountability and the social pressure that comes with letting your colleagues down are teams that seldom miss the deadlines, because they know that it's not just Danielle as our hypothetical manager that is going to hold me accountable. Every person in this organization is concerned about the commitments we make. And everybody wants accountability, because accountability is the only thing that leads to results. So you need to get people comfortable with this. And just like in these other dysfunctions, if you've mastered trust, if you've mastered conflict, if you've mastered commitment, it's a lot easier to deal with accountability. Because if somebody knows that they exist in a relationship where they can have a hard conversation with Steve, then Amanda doesn't feel bad. She's like, okay, I will go talk to him, right? And they have a simple conversation, they get it back on track, they move forward, and the project continues without all the other rigmarole of trying to deal with the peer-to-leader accountability, which is often overstructured and really has too many consequences for it. There's only so many times that a leader can have that conversation with a peer before it starts to color and affect something like a performance review, right? Before you have a note in your file and it becomes up and a lot of times gets blown out of proportion. So peer-to-peer actually works to mitigate those situations of accountability, get things back on track, and use the social glue of the organization to get everyone moving together. So Lavonda, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I think compassion is really important too, because oftentimes when when your coworker is not doing something, you're not privy to personal information. And just reaching out to them and saying, hey, the report was due last Friday. Is there anything that's keeping you from being able to successfully complete it? Because I need it to do my job. And you'll find out that oftentimes people are just not focused. Like the young lady I went to ask about it, she said, you know, my uncle died, but he's in Mexico, so I can't go. And I'm just logged into work trying to do my very best. And at that point, I'm like, okay, well, just send it to me. I'll generate it. And then I'll get the information from the other girl and we'll just send it out. It's just a little compassion sometimes. And then you do need to ask people what's going on, because it's not always they don't want to do their work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially now. I mean, people are dealing with so many, really dire situations, deaths in the family, COVID complications, maybe even their own health complications or their own stress and anxiety related to the fact that the world's going through this. That you're right. That's an opportunity where instead of getting angry, you actually have the opportunity to show some compassion. And maybe you had to do a little more work by fixing the report or helping your colleague along. But you also probably earned a ton of endearment and a ton of trust because you said, you're human. And if my close direct family member died too, I would be torn up and my head would be in other places. So we can cover for you. We can have some slack, go deal with that because we know you're a good guy. We know you're not a bad employee. But if it comes up to the point where it rises to the level of a very formal, very structured conversation with you as the leader, then this person's going to go, well, they don't care about me because my uncle just died, but yet they still had me in the office, in the chair with the door closed, right? To get to the same point. Really good point. Really good point. Okay. So now I want your opinion, and I want anybody that's willing to have an opinion to share your opinion on this, because this next exercise is designed to help you build accountability on a peer-to-peer level with your teams. But I'll tell you, right, that this is like a high risk opportunity. This is like flying without a safety net in terms of your management science. So what I want to know is, would you guys ever do an exercise like this with your teams? So if you read this exercise, this is an exercise called the team effectiveness exercise, and it asks you to write down answers to the two questions that are presented here. And one question is a good question. What behavioral characteristics or quality demonstrated by this person, you do this for every member of the team, contributes to our strength? And then conversely, what's the single most important behavioral characteristic or quality demonstrated by this person that sometimes derails the team? And then you go around the room and you share this in real time, not anonymously, for every member on your team. So now you see why it's a little high risk, right? Because you've got people openly talking about their shortcomings and the shortcomings of their colleagues in real time in a meeting. What do we think? Could we ever do it? Should we ever do it? Or is this like, no way, no how, not on God's green earth? And I'll get the chat up because I lost the chat on my window. So let me find it where it went in all my windows.
I'm glad to
here.
see that someone would do it, but in my unit, I don't think it would be successful.
Okay. I think that's very fair and completely honest. I've definitely had organizations where I was like, nope, I know the players. And even if I worked on teamwork for the rest of my life, never would go over well. Any other thoughts?
So would it be like everyone has to say about everyone in the unit?
Yep.
Oh my gosh. I feel like it'll be a 50-50. Because I think that some people are going to be able to take it and they probably know that about themselves enough to know that, okay, I'm working on it. But I know some people that will probably log off and never log back in. So.
Yep. So what I would say is for this accountability exercise, right, the risk reward trade-off is there, because if you can do it, if you get your team to a place where they could do this, this is the most valuable thing that you can do, because this honestly is the accountability you're looking for. This is people in a healthy, constructive way being able to talk about the elephants in the room. Because you know, if you have that one team member and everyone knows that they react in a certain way and it derails it, we all know that information. We're just choosing not to talk about it because it might be uncomfortable. But the reality of the situation exists. And as long as we don't talk about those difficult things, nothing ever changes, right? It's also tough too, because as a manager, oftentimes you have to be the one that talks about those difficult things. But you're not the only one that's concerned, or you're not the only one that stands to lose or benefit by the team overcoming those things. And so when you get more peer-to-peer accountability, you get help from your other team members to really call things like they are and see reality for what it is. But it takes a long time to get here. So this might not be something that you want to use lightly, because this could be the best thing you ever do. Or like you said, this could cause somebody to log on and never log off. But accountability is important. And the more we can make peer-to-peer accountability, and the more we can make that our starting point for accountability rather than peer-to-leader, the better we can do. For a culture of accountability to thrive, the leader must be brave. He or she must demonstrate the willingness to confront these difficult issues, whether it be about yourself or about your colleagues. If you can do this, then peer-to-peer accountability has a chance. If you can't do this, well, then you might as well just keep doing it, peer-to-leader only. But it's harder to do it that way in the long run. It's more tiring. It's more taxing on you. And you don't have as much time to get stuff done because you're always trying to be the team's traffic cop, figuring it out. Okay, the last dysfunction that we need to deal with is an inattention to results, or an inability to focus on results. And a lot of times I hear common objections, right? These are things you may have heard said in your organization. Well, it's out of sight, out of mind. I just have to manage one day at a time. This is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to come here and do my job, and I don't really think about the big picture. I'm doing my part. It's not my job to be concerned with the results as a whole. It's the leaders. It's yours. It's the manager above you. It's the manager above them, right? I'm just supposed to be a machine. I'm an automaton. I just come in here and do my job, and that's all I do. Well, these are excuses, and these excuses don't really help the organization move forward, right? Everyone should be concerned about results, because that's the only thing that makes it sustainable. That's the only way that DPSS is able to achieve its mission. So when you see that your employees are unable to focus on results, it's probably because individual distractions are taking hold. And those distractions include things like ego, an over concern for career advancement, or maybe even compensation itself. So a lot of times when ego comes into play, team members say, well, I don't want to be responsible for results because I'm not sure if we're going to be successful. And rather than feel individual shame of being unsuccessful, of being a failure, I'd rather just pretend that it's someone else's goal. And I'd rather sit in the peanut gallery and say, well, I thought it was a dumb idea and that's why it didn't work. So I'm still 100%. I did everything right. It was just bad management, right? So I'm good. It's just somebody else's problem. You can't say that. You can't say that on my team. You shouldn't be able to say that on your teams, right? We're in this together. If you've got somebody like that, that is one where you do need to close the door and say, hey, that doesn't work. Individual results are not more important than organizational results, right? That's like, LeBron James, when he got traded to the Heat, and he was really arrogant. And he said, we're not going to win one championship. We're not going to win 2 championships. We're not going to win 3 championships, 4, 5. He went all the way up to 7 championships in this press conference. And then for the first 2 years, he was on the Heat, the Miami Heat. They didn't even make the playoffs. But yet, LeBron James is the best player in basketball, right? He could do it all. It was his ego driving that. And it was his ego that was causing the team not to perform. You'll hear compensation come up a lot when you hear people say, well, they don't pay me enough to care about that. That's not in my job description. That's somebody else's, right? So while you may have said those things, while I may have said those things from time to time, again, those are individual distractions to organization's result, because we're not really having a conversation about compensation when we're talking about results. If the organization succeeds, we're all more likely to have more compensation. That's undeniable, right? You'll be the best performer, you'll rise, you will get the promotion, right? So results are actually a gateway to higher compensation. So when you have employees that say things like, they don't pay me enough to be concerned about that, I'm always quick to remind them in a polite way, not to make them feel bad, but I say, we're not really talking about compensation here. We're talking about results. We do have times where we talk about compensation, we have performance reviews, you're on a salary schedule, you move up in the organization and you earn more money by doing these things. And that's really clear in the public sector. But today we're talking about results. We're not talking about your paycheck. So let's get back to focusing on what our team's going to do to achieve the results, because we very much need to do that, right? Pull it back in. And then finally, sometimes you'll find people on they're what I call ladder climbers. They're people that are just trying to rise in the organization as fast as they can. And so they really don't want to be burdened with the results of the team overall. They just kind of want to be on the projects that make them look good, or they want to be close to the person that's going to promote them, or they want to only learn the skills and capabilities that are going to allow them to ascend. So again, in all three of these distractions, the individual is placing more value on his or her personal results than they are on the organizational results. And if we're not, as managers, making people care about the organizational results with all the tools that we've described today, then they will fill the void by simply trying to make sense of it on their own. So again, this doesn't mean you have bad people. If you see ego, compensation, and career advancement as individual distractions to results, it means that we're not spending enough time communicating results. And if we spend more time communicating results, then our teams will care more about those results than they will about their individual success. But that's hard to do, right? That kind of begs the $64,000 question of what can we do to make this happen, right? It's easy to say, here's the distractions and here's what we shouldn't see, but what should we actually see? And the best way I've found to do this is to start communicating what I call your team scoreboard. So this is a way to kind of gamify what you do and what the team does to create metrics around KPIs, which are key performance indicators, that allow you to communicate what needs to happen on the team. And I'm sure you have metrics that come down from higher levels of the organization about what you need to do. But are those the only metrics that you care about as managers? Or are there other things that you use to gauge the effectiveness of your team that maybe but that you don't always communicate to your staff, right? There are things you look for to spot issues and problems, but they may not be things that you talk about with your team. So when you construct this scoreboard, you don't always have to do it in a really sophisticated way. We don't need fancy spreadsheets and dashboards or integrated data analytics suites or any of the stuff that modern technology gives us. Sometimes we just need to know where we stand, right? We just need to run through the numbers every time we come together as a team. Or we need to be like the fundraiser at your child's elementary school where, the principal comes out and on a big piece of poster paper, they start drawing in, a bar graph saying, hey, we've raised $50,000. Our goal is to raise $70,000. And then we can buy more books for the library or whatever they're trying to do, right? They keep it real simple. As you see that graph going up, the main entrance of the school, all the students, all the teachers, all the parents know that the score is being raised, right? Because if we do this and we communicate it openly to our team, we let them see what we want to happen and we talk about results while there's still time to make incremental decisions or what we call decisions at the margin. We can still do things to change it. If we wait until the team has failed or the team has underperformed, then results become a negative thing because we're not working to build results and we're not working to make incremental decisions. We're working to rationalize failure. And that's hard, because if the only time I ever talk to you about results are when you're doing poorly, when we have an issue, then you will see results as a negative thing. And you'll try to avoid those emails, avoid those conversations. Only do the minimum so that somebody doesn't get in your face about it. But if we see results as goals, we say we want to win the game, right? We've scored 10 points, the other team has 12 points. We just need to score 3 more points and then we're in the lead. Then it's something people can get behind. It's something that becomes productive in terms of their discourse. It's not negative in terms of you didn't measure up. You didn't meet the quota. You didn't get enough done. So now something bad is going to happen to you individually, and maybe something bad is going to happen to the team. So it's a mindset shift. And most of the time it happens with the way you communicate goals. Don't ever use a productivity metric to slap an employee with it. Don't ever start a conversation by saying, you're not doing enough. Because everyone is working full-time. Everyone always feels like what he or she is doing is the best they can do. I don't oftentimes meet people that are like, yeah, I know I'm slacking off. I'm giving you 50%, boss. I could give you 50% more. No, right? That's starting a conversation on the defensive, right? Value what they're doing. Hey, team, we're doing great this month. We've achieved 50% of our goal. We've got 20 days left in the month. We can do this. What do we need to do to help? What resources do you need? What can I do to help you? Be the cheerleader for your team. Move them forward, inspire them to do it. And what you'll find is in any given period, people will give you, and I'm not even kidding, up to 20% more when you do this. It's amazing. Simply because you approach this as a game that somebody can win rather than a consequence that's going to hit them or hurt them. Questions about that, about using a team scoreboard, focusing on results? It's all simple stuff, but it's really hard to put into practice. My advice, again, is keep it simple. Whatever you decide is the way to best communicate the metrics of your team, do it in a way that's easy for you as a manager to prepare and stay on top of. Because if you overcomplicate it with a fancy spreadsheet, you're going to get tired of doing it, and then results fade into the background, and they only become a conversation of what happens when expectations aren't met, rather than what we need to do for goal attainment and success. Okay, so as I mentioned, right, the only true measure of a great team is what it accomplishments. All 3 of these guys here on my example, Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh, fantastic basketball players. Until they started working together as a team, and until they found some other players that helped these guys drop their big egos, they didn't win. They didn't do anything. Once they got that dynamic figured out, they won 2 back-to-back championships. So sports is a fun analogy, but it's not always the best analogy. My point is when you focus on results, you have to avoid all those individual distractions, right? Team members must prioritize the results of the team over their individual needs, right? You don't start by winning 7 championships. You start by winning 1 championship, right? And you start by winning 1 game, and then you win 1 series, and then you win the playoffs, right? You move forward, little incremental steps. Decisions at the margin are the only way to move forward to success.